Hello again. Some of Parliament's most important work happens in select committees. The House of Commons departmental select committees are amongst the most powerful and influential means that Parliament has to hold the government to account. And the House of Lords select committees play an important role in raising awareness in issues to do with Europe, science, economics, communications, international relations, and the Constitution. In this video, you will learn about the work of select committees. But rather than hear what I have to say, I thought it would be more interesting for you to hear the inside view, as it were. So I talked over Microsoft Teams to Dr Jack Simson-Caird, Assistant Counsel to the House of Commons Justice Select Committee, which shadows the Ministry of Justice. We talked about his work with the Commons Justice Committee and how this related to the broader constitutional function of Parliament. Okay, Jack. Hello, Jack.
Hello, Lindsay.
Hi. So thanks for agreeing to talk to me and talk to our students over Microsoft Teams. Jack, you have a very interesting sounding job title. You are Assistant Counsel to the Commons Justice Select Committee. So could you tell me what that actually means?
Thanks, Lindsay. Yes. So my role on the committee is as a legal specialist. So the Justice Committee, its role is to scrutinise the work of the Ministry of Justice, and each select committee employs a number of specialist researchers to support the work of the committee. That is normally to run inquiries for the committee, and because of the Justice Committee's area of focus being the justice system, it employs two specialists, and one of them is the one that covers courts is normally a lawyer. So the reason I have a slightly different job title from my colleagues who are called specialists, they cover things any other area that committees cover, is because I'm also employed as a lawyer. The House of Commons employs about between 20 and 30 lawyers who are all called, the main lawyer is called Speaker's Counsel. So her name is Sarah Salimi. She's the main, the top dog, as it were, in the House of Commons. And then there are Deputy Counsel, and then the lower rung, which I am on, is Assistant Counsel. So I'm also not just a specialist to the committee, but I'm also employed as a lawyer in the House. So I can kind of involve myself in other projects that come up as by virtue of being a lawyer in the House.
So I had a little look on the web just before we talked, and I saw that the Justice Committee is currently undertaking 9 different inquiries, everything from the work of the Lord Chancellor to the future of the probation service to the children and young people in custody, private prosecutions. So that's a really broad role. So how does the Select Committee actually carry out its, how does it carry it out, its role in holding government to account in all of these areas? What does it do?
That's a good question, Lindsay. As I say, the overall focus of the committee, overall aim of each committee, they were set up in the 1970s to provide a sort of specialist focus of the Commons' scrutiny work to shadow each particular department. So each government department, the Home Office, the Treasury has its own committee that shadows it, and in practice, what that scrutiny involves is that is essentially in the form of inquiries, which is the committee decides to look into a particular matter which comes within the remit of the ministry, of the department that is responsible for shadowing. Now, obviously, in real life, we know that it's not always the case that a particular issue fits neatly within one department. Lots of issues are cross-cutting. So sometimes a committee will look into an issue that covers more than one department. But generally, they try to sort of avoid stepping on too many other committees' toes. So they try to focus on issues. So you'll see that the list that you read out there reflects the fact that the Ministry of Justice covers that its bulk of its responsibility is prisons, probation, and courts are those. Those are the three main things that the Ministry of Justice does. So the committee spends a lot of its time thinking about the prison system and issues with probation and the many issues that come up to do with that, and then also the courts. What often I think you're alluding to your question is in terms of sometimes the most high-profile thing that a committee does is question the minister. So most committees have the ministers, their relevant minister or Secretary of State in periodically 2 or 3 times a year to ask them questions. So that's a kind of more direct form of accountability. So not necessarily connected to the committee's inquiry work. We have sort of, I think we've had the Lord Chancellor 3 or 4 times in this year to talk about a variety of things. Obviously, to talk a lot about the impacts of COVID on prisons and courts, but also to cover sort of. But then when we have them, we'll also ask him about questions to do with our inquiries. So a major role of the committees that the public and the media often focuses on is the way in which we actually hold the individual, the politician, in our case, Robert Buckland, the Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice, to account by asking him questions in those sessions.
And excellent. And when the committee has concerns about something, as it does, and when it either calls ministers or potentially civil servants to speak before the committee, what sort of things can it do to impress upon government the need for change? How can it bring concerns? How can it bring a remedy to change if it has to?
So that's a really good point. So I think that sort of there is I suppose a degree of tension between sort of what people perceive as the accountability function of asking difficult questions of ministers, and saying, why haven't you done this, why haven't you done that, and then the sort of more longer term work that committees do for inquiries of looking into an issue, taking evidence from people, sometimes also including civil servants and the ministers themselves, talking to academics, talking to lots of different experts, and then gathering evidence and then writing a report. So that exercise of trying to influence government policy is a lot more collaborative, and it isn't really about necessarily just holding the government to account. It's about trying to work out what's going on in a policy area and trying to make recommendations of influencing the government. Now, the committees themselves don't have any powers to make legislation or to force the government to do anything. So in that sense, if committees are going to have influence, they've got to kind of have a collaborative relationship with government, and also conduct inquiries in such a way that means that there's a chance that the government might listen to them. So sometimes there's, I think, a tension between the work the committees do in criticising government, which is important, and saying you're doing these things wrong, and also the work that they do in terms of exploring issues and working out solutions to difficult policy problems.
I mean, that's interesting that you speak of a kind of a collaborative approach, because, I mean, playing devil's advocate, perhaps, I suppose a cynical view might be that I don't think many people would fault the quality of select committee reports. They're thoroughly researched, they have a lot of information in them, they do their work thoroughly. But, what happens next? I mean, a cynical view would be the reports go to government, the government responds saying they've taken note of the concerns, and they will do maybe 1 or 2 cosmetic things, but policy continues as a whole. Do you think that's perhaps an unfair view?
I think that it's a really interesting point, because I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because I think it was about 10 years ago, the Constitution Unit based at UCL did some research on the influence of select committees. Some political scientists did some real analysis looking through recommendations, made by select committees over a considerable period, and tried to analyse to what extent those recommendations influence government policy. And I think there are some notable examples I think which were in some of their some of their work. For example, I think the ban on smoking indoors originated, I think, in a select committee report. I mean, it's difficult, like with all these things, to prove causation. It's not necessarily that a committee says X and the government does Y, and that's the way that the system works. I think what's important is you've got to see there's a kind of communicative value of getting the members engaged with a subject on a cross-party basis. I think that's one of the crucial things about committees, is that they're cross-party, so that if you can come to a unanimous, most like 95% of committee reports represent the views of every single member on the committee. So if you can get a cross-party committee to have agreement on a controversial issue, let's say something like social care or Brexit, then that potentially is influential, because the government may look at it and think, well, if these people from all different, across the political spectrum could agree on an idea, then that can have an influence. And also those members hearing the evidence from people who are sort of impartial, or maybe not necessarily impartial in the sense of, what I mean is hearing from experts about, the evidence that's out there on a particular question, can have an impact on how they view government policy. So what I'm sort of saying is that it's not always possible to prove a direct impact. And you're right that a lot of the time I think the government may choose to ignore them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that in the longer term that there isn't some kind of value in kind of developing these kind of cross-party recommendations.
Interesting. And I'll just pick up on something you said, which is, you pointed out absolutely correctly, that select committees don't have legislative powers, but they do have a role in legislation, don't they?
I think you're talking about the fact that departmental select committees in theory well, not in theory, in reality they do some work doing pre-legislative scrutiny. So and they can also get involved in post-legislative scrutiny as well. So I think it's the important point to draw out there, and something I've had a long interest in before I joined the House, is that departmental select committees, comparatively compared to other committees in other legislatures around the world, are unusual in that they don't look at bills as they're going through the House. So they don't sort of routinely look at most committees around the world. Subject-specific committees like the Justice Committee would then scrutinise legislation that came before the House on legislation. That's kind of a logical combination of functions. But interestingly, when they were designing select committees, they decided that they should focus on holding the department for account, and that the work of scrutinising legislation should be focused on the floor of the House and in what are called public bill committees, which are not subject-specific committees. So in the kind of day-to-day work of committees, I have to say that although you're right to say, Lindsay, they do sometimes do pre-legislative scrutiny and some post-legislative scrutiny, in practice, legislation isn't a big part of their day-to-day work. One notable thing to say about that in the current context with COVID-19 is that because delegated legislation has become more prominent, there have been examples of select committees like the Justice Committee writing letters, which again is something else that we can do, which can be influential, writing letters to departments and to secretaries of state about SIs that are drawn to our attention, about SIs being a form of the most common form of delegated legislation. So that's something that might change.
Instruments.
Statutory instruments, sorry to use jargon, but yeah, no, that's something that might change. Who knows if the current interest in secondary legislation keeps growing as it is, because people are very aware that the government is using delegated legislation known as statutory instruments to impose lockdown restrictions and public health restrictions, as it has the right to in the relevant legislation. But that doesn't give parliamentarians much of an opportunity to scrutinise those laws before they come into effect. So it may be the case that in future committees take more interest in legislation, including delegated legislation.
Yeah, there's something very British about a system of government that places so much emphasis on the role played by generalists. You see that in the civil service, for example, and I'm sort of wondering, is that the kind of influence that shapes the decision that select committees who are the most expert on a particular topic are not the most involved in drafting or scrutinising legislation?
No, I think that is part of it. I think the sense was that accountability, it was a sort of, maybe there's a lot written on this particularly in political science, sort of parliamentary affairs journals and that sort of thing. I think that the sense was prioritising accountability was more important. And if you look at a lot of select committees, the most high profile work they do now actually is often nothing even to do with departments. If you look at the well-known example of Philip Green, the former owner of BHS, there was a huge storm around what he had done in terms of pensions, and the relevant select committee held sessions with him, essentially holding him to account, a citizen, a resident of Monaco in his case, but holding him to account for his actions and his impact on people. So, select committees now, I think, play kind of a broader accountability role, not just holding government to account, but also holding other people to account. The other famous example worth Googling is the Commons Committee of Culture, Media and Sport. It's famous session with Rupert Murdoch. So it's actually, if you look at the kind of remit of committees, they've always, I think, focusing on accountability of policies in departments and decision making in department more than legislation. So I think it's also part of the kind of particular nature of the relationship between law and politics in British, in Westminster, which is very different, I think, from other places like the United States, where I think that in Congress, a committee will employ lots of lawyers, and the role of lawyers will be a lot more prominent in the way that the legislature functions. Whereas I think in the UK, it's a much, as you say, the focus on kind of generalist policy advice is a bit more marked.
Mm-hmm. And how independent are these committees of government? We in the legislative context, we often talk about ours being a system of executive dominance. Is the executive dominant in the work of the accountability of select committees?
Well, I'd say no, they're not. There is definitely a degree of independence. I think that I suppose it's how you see the relationship between Parliament and the between the government and the House of Commons more generally will influence how you understand the independence of select committees. I think the big development there was that the Wright reforms, which came as a product of Tony Wright, who was a well-known Labour MP who was asked by Gordon Brown to lead a committee to come up with reforms to make the House of Commons more independent, I think, fair, and to improve its scrutiny of government in the light of the expenses scandal in the late 2000s. And he came up with some proposals to sort of strengthen scrutiny of select committees. And one of the crucial ones was that the chairs of select committees, rather than being essentially appointed by what's known as the usual channels, which is essentially deals between the leaders of the relevant party, would be elected by the whole House. And that was a kind of a good example of how institutional changes like that can have a big difference on the way that these operate. So now at the start of every parliament, there is a contest to be a chair of each committee. And that may mean that the person that the government thinks should do it isn't the person who wins, because they've got to get a majority of the members voting to win that seat, and that will often go to someone who maybe the House. It relies on opposition votes. So you, for example, if there's a contest between two members and one is thought by the opposition, two members from the government side, but the opposition thinks that the be particularly effective, then that one might stand a better chance of winning because he has to appeal to the opposition side. So that's a good example of a kind of institutional reform that has kind of made select committees arguably more independent. And you've got some very high profile chairs of select committees who, and now, it's quite common for former secretaries of state to be chairs of select committees. Jeremy Hunt at Health, for example, which I think there were still high profile chairs before these reforms happened, but I think there is a general sense that it's increased their visibility and made it a more attractive option for a member of parliament as a kind of career option, because the committees are quite high profile now and seen to be independent.
You might be pleased to know that we now recommend Tony Wright's book, British Politics, A Very Short Introduction, as preliminary reading for public law here at Sussex. One of his reforms that wasn't taken up was replacing the leader of the House, and that's a cabinet member, with a House Business Committee. Is there anything you can tell us about that? Is that still on the agenda?
I've got no inside info on that. I mean, I think the general thing, the interesting thing there was really highlighted in the 1719 Parliament was a rule in what's called the standing orders, which are basically the internal legislation that regulates how Parliament works. There's a famous standing order, notorious to some, called Standing Order 14, which basically gives the government of the day control of the timetable. And that, to some, it's actually a key democratic tool, because it gives the government, who has a majority by virtue of winning a general election, the tools to control, what legislation is debated when, and essentially get its legislative program through the House of Commons. But for other people, it's a kind of, it gives the government an unfair advantage in terms of how the House of Commons works, and sort of limits the extent to which the backbenchers, both the government and the opposition, can influence the way in which parliamentary business is done. So there was quite a lot of controversy about this in the context of Brexit. And I think it sort of reached a bit of an impasse in that ultimately in the Brexit debates, which were very sort of highly charged, it was shown that in some circumstances, if the government doesn't have a majority, backbenchers can take control of the timetable on specific examples, albeit relying on some seriously challenging procedural manoeuvres, but they can do it if they want to. And they did do it. They showed that that was possible. But then ultimately, when we returned to majority government after the general election in December 2019, now the government has control of the order paper, not just because of Standing Order 14, but also because it has a majority of 80, which it has by virtue of winning a general election, which is a democratic right, so to speak. So, but I think the general point about an independent backbench or a business committee would be that it would be at least seen that the whole House would be taking decisions, much in the same way as I set out in relation to chairs of select committees, would be taking the formal decision of what to debate when. So it would give the formal control of the timetable to the whole House, and that's perceived to have some kind of democratic advantages.
Jack, thanks. I'll just ask one final question. If there's one thing that you'd like students to know about select committees, but they won't necessarily find it in the textbook, what would it be?
what they wouldn't find in the textbooks. I think the biggest insight I can give, I think, which is how inquiries work, I suppose, and how I think sometimes you look at a committee's report or a committee taking evidence or grilling a minister or something, and it's not necessarily clear to the public how the actual mechanics of a committee operates, and I think that's quite interesting in terms of a kind of understanding how decision making works in other areas of kind of political life. In that, the role of the secretariat, essentially, we support the secretariat being the staff of the committee. There's about 5 or 6 of us, and we basically do a lot. Run the administration of the committee. The clerks of the committee. The clerk of the committee is the kind of head of the secretariat. He's kind of in charge. He works directly with the chairman in terms of making sure everything runs on time and making sure everything works. But then, as the specialists and the lawyers help the committee in terms of advising it and facilitate it in terms of making decisions. But ultimately, sometimes people say, it's not the individual members that write the report, it's the staff of the committee, which is obviously true in the sense that it's the staff who actually sit there typing the report. But what that doesn't reveal is actually that it is always the committee's report, because there's a very rigorous process that goes on in terms of agreeing the report. So after a report is written up, it then has to be voted on, much in the same way that members vote on legislation. They vote on the actual report paragraph by paragraph, so agreeing to every line of the report. So in that, when a report is agreed, individual members will put forward amendments to particular paragraphs, and so there is that whole process gives the members of the committee ownership over what the staff have kind of helped the committee to produce. So it's quite interesting like that, sort of seeing it from the inside, because a lot of the time I think it's probably the same in the courts and in government, that often the end result has had lots of people behind it producing the work, but it's down to kind of formal public law processes that actually convert that work into an output of Parliament, or an output of the court, or the output of the government. And it's quite interesting to see that process in action.
Jack Simson-Caird, it's been wonderful talking to you, and thank you very much.
Pleasure. I hope we've kind of not too much jargon, but yeah, it's always a pleasure to talk to the students.
Thank you. Goodbye. I hope you enjoyed hearing Jack talk about his work. For me, the most interesting thing that came out of our conversation was the way he described select committees trying to influence policy, as much through partnership with the government as through confrontation. It's not always like that, of course, but this method of working underscores the understanding of the role of Parliament both in sustaining the executive as well as holding it to account. If you want to learn more, I recommend that you check out the Parliament website, which is a really excellent resource. You'll find a video series on select committees in the House of Lords, and maybe you could read a report of a select committee on an area of policy that you're interested in. That will give you a feel for the work they do. And I'll see you in a future video.